Now this morning I'm going to give you the background to this project, what we actually did, how you were involved, and probably most importantly, the benefits and outcomes of the project. Now this works across two trusts, a whākau and another trust. I am referring to them as Trust A and Trust B, but Trust A is a whākau trust. We are doing that at this stage to protect the identity of the details of the trusts as it goes into the public forum. And as Shona said, we'll have discussion around that, how much of the details you want to be released at the end of this session. But for the purposes of this presentation, the names of the trusts are in fact camouflaged. So, starting with the purpose of this project. And the purpose of the project is to develop a decision support tool which helps Māori land trustees and advisors improve the management, the environmental sustainability, the production and the profitability of Māori land. And in essence, it was designed to support trusts to move from a passive to a more active model of land use, and to support the trusts to become business ready so that they could take advantage of the commercial opportunities that were out there. The key objectives of this program were firstly to develop tools and systems that benefit Māori in the management of their land, and secondly to develop models of best practice for trustees in the areas of governance, communication, stakeholder engagement, decision making and risk management. And that was designed to assist the trusts to become more business focused, so they were better able to investigate ways to manage their land to improve the returns, but at the same time protect the cultural, social and environmental values that Māori hold so dear. The project itself had 3 stages. Stage 1 was a capability assessment, which occurred between February and April 2014. And I'm sure if you cast your minds back, you remember the days that you actually sat in a room and underwent the capability assessment across 5 areas. Stage 2 was the monitoring and evaluation, and that was between August 2014 and January 2016. And stage 3 is what we're doing now. It's dissemination of the results and our findings to the wider community. If we look at the participating trusts, there were 2 trusts participating in this project, and they have been called Trust A and Trust B. Trust A was an Mana Whenua Trust located in the central North Island. It's a high country wilderness site of forest, scrubland and adjacent to 2 rivers. In terms of land use, there was a conservation covenant, hunting and fishing licences and Manukau honey production licence. Trust B was also an Mana Whenua Trust, located on the east coast of the North Island. They had a significant aggregation of land. Their land was planted in grapes and the land was leased for contract wine production. In terms of the characteristics of each trust, Trust A had a capacity for 7 trustees, Trust B capacity for 8. Both of them had a whānau representation model of trustee appointment. Both had voluntary trustees. Trust A had a part-time administrator, Trust B had no paid staff. Both trusts had a broad range of skills and experience in the trustees. Trust B had 2 very long-serving trustees that had been there for many, many years. One of the key differences between the 2 trusts was that Trust A was willing to embrace change, whereas Trust B had a very conservative and risk-averse attitude and, as we found, was not willing to embrace change. So what happened? What was the capability development process that we actually used? Well, the capability development tool was actually a process. It wasn't a discrete entity. It was a process. And it comprised a number of components. There was an assessment and support package designed to strengthen and support trust decision-making. But most importantly, it was customised and targeted to the needs of each trust. It wasn't an off-the-shelf product, it was customised and targeted. And the needs of each trust were identified in the capability assessment that we undertook with you way back in 2014. And the whole program was rolled out over a 2-year period. The tool had 2 main steps. Step 1 was the capability assessment, and step 2 was the use of the results chain model, which I'll talk about in more detail shortly. And that was for achieving outcomes and results, but also it was used for monitoring the program and for evaluating the performance and outcomes and achievements. Now, each of those tools had a number of components. If we look at step 1, the capability assessment, it had 4 components. Firstly, there was a self-assessment questionnaire to determine the skills and competencies in governance. Secondly, there was a facilitated capability assessment, gap analysis and needs analysis session. And that looked at 5 key areas: governance in general, decision-making, internal and external communication, stakeholder engagement, which included the interaction with the trust beneficial owners and also the external parties that they were working with, including licence holders and lessees. And the final one was risk management. We held a workshop to identify the potential land use options. And that workshop involved generating ideas as to what potential land use options were available and the issues that the trustees needed to consider when moving from a passive model of land use to a more active model of owner-operated. Trustees were able to apply some of the tools that they had already learnt during the course of that workshop, particularly around decision-making and in the evaluation of options. And for Trust B, we provided additional information from an agribusiness consultant on alternative crops and the potential returns from those crops. The final stage of step 1 was the production of a capability assessment report with recommendations and recommendations for further action. Step 2 also had 4 components, and that was where we looked at using the results chain model. The first step in that process was the development of project plans, and those project plans were based on the recommendations from the capability assessment. And I'm sure all of you will remember working through these particular documents. That was the project plans, and that was one of the very valuable tools that we were able to provide to you. Part of that process was developing output, outcome and impact indicators to identify what tasks needed to be done and what deliverables were to be delivered and by when. There were also 2 monitoring sessions to monitor progress. And the purpose of those monitoring sessions was to record achievements on each project since the start of the program and whether the trustees had in fact been able to achieve the targets that had been set for them. The monitoring sessions also identified any ongoing support or assistance which was required to progress the projects, and they were particularly valuable in identifying roadblocks or impediments to progress, and we were able to assist the trustees to get over some of those blockages. The sessions were designed to be supportive to trustees and to be a positive learning experience for them, and I certainly hope that the trustees did find them helpful. The final part of step 2 was measuring the outcomes and results, which was the evaluation phase. And I'm sure you will all remember undergoing the evaluation process in November with the various workshops that we had and the various questionnaires that you participated in. And of course, that is still continuing with some interviews for individual trustees at the moment. And we certainly thank you for your participation in that. It was quite a session. The capability development tool and its steps were supported by various tools and templates and by best practice models and processes. We also provided referrals, contacts and introductions for external assistance where that was required. And some of the tools and best practice models that we provided to the trustees were in the areas of governance systems and processes, the results chain process and working towards goals and deliverables, project plans which provided a step-by-step account of what needed to be done and how the trustees were going to get there, developing a governance manual, decision-making template and process, and that was regarded as particularly valuable, I think, by both trusts. We provided methods for evaluating options in decision-making so that decisions could be based on solid evidence. There was a risk management framework, communication plan, a model of trustee appointment based on skill, competency and rotation, and something on managing board meetings to make them more effective. And right throughout that process, Shona and I provided mentoring to provide assistance and to remove any roadblocks to progress. I'd like to talk a little bit about the results chain model. I mentioned it earlier, and this was probably, in association with the project plans, the single most valuable tool that we were able to provide to the trust. Results chain provides a link between planning and between monitoring and evaluation of results. And it basically describes what stakeholders want to achieve, why they want to achieve it, and how they go about it. And I'm sure you remember that diagram, because we had it on a big A3 sheet of paper in one of the sessions that we were working with you. The green, just still up there, the green blocks are the planning phase of the results chain. That's the area where you set goals, you set objectives, what do you want to actually do? The grey area is the activities, inputs and outputs. Now, the activities is what you actually need to do to produce the deliverables. The outputs are the actual deliverables. And the orange part of that chain model, results chain model, is the outcomes and impacts. The outcomes is what we want to achieve in the longer term, and the impacts are the changes that we want to see, again, in the longer term. Now, with this project, because the project only went for 2 years, we are not really able to measure impacts. That will occur 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. But we were able to measure some of the outcomes and the benefits of the program in transit, if you like. Project plans, well, they were part of the results chain, and the recommendations from the capability assessment were translated into targeted project plans. As part of that process, we identified project leaders, people who were going to step up and lead and drive each project. There were a number of implementation steps which were identified. What did the trustees have to do to achieve the results? We identified target results and target outcomes that we wanted the trustees to achieve and the timelines for implementation of those. We looked at resourcing, mainly around the personnel. Did the trust have the internal personnel to do a particular project, or was it going to be necessary to look outside the resources of the trust and bring in external parties? And we also put in place target output and outcome performance indicators, which would enable the trustees to know when they'd actually achieved the results that they set out to achieve. In terms of the two trusts, with Trust A, the capability study identified 8 target outcome areas for action for Trust A and 7 for Trust B. For Trust A, project plans were developed for 7 of those 8 areas, but for Trust B, project plans were developed for only 3 of those areas. And if we look in a little more detail at the various project plans which were developed, and firstly for Trust A. The project plans were aligned to the Trust's existing strategic plan, and we did that quite deliberately to enable this process to support the implementation of the Trust strategy. And the two areas of Trust Day's strategy that were relevant were our people and our land. Under our people, we had 4 project plans: trustee capability development, governance processes and boardroom practices, trustee appointment model, and stakeholder engagement and communication. And I'm just going to tell you what each of those was designed to do. Trustee capability development was designed to encourage trustees to undertake capability development to further develop their governance skills in a range of areas. Governance processes and boardroom practices. That was to ensure that their governance systems and processes were documented, were current, and reflected best practice. And when we started working with the Trust, the governance manual that the Trust had at that time was largely operational. They weren't thinking in a strategic space, and hopefully the new manual will address that. The trustee appointment model, that was to consider a change from the current whānau representation model for trustee appointment to a model based on the selection of trustees with the skills and competencies required in a governance role. The stakeholder engagement and communication project, that had 2 parts to it. The first part was an internal focus and looked at improving the frequency, process and format of communication and engagement with the beneficial owners. The second part was externally focused, focusing outside the Trust, and that looked at improving the communication and interrelationships with the external stakeholders, including future potential business partners. The category of our land, that had 3 project plans in that space. There was land use and productivity, alternative approaches to generate income, and collaboration, which included the development of joint ventures and partnerships. And if we just briefly look at each of those, the land use and productivity project was to develop initiatives to maximise the productive capacity and financial return from the land. There were 2 components to that. The first was the identification and evaluation of potential alternatives for land use. And secondly, looking at changing from a passive to a more active model of Manukau honey production. The alternative approaches to generate income project, that investigated ways to increase financial returns to the Trust through the development of an investment framework and strategy, and by diversifying investments. And finally, the collaboration project. This probably was part of the glue that held the other projects together. And it was designed to actively pursue the development of joint ventures and other collaborative partnerships to support commercial development and provide opportunities for capability development. The project plans for Trust B. There were only 3 of them, and again they were aligned to the strategic plan, growing our people, good stewardship and growing our business. And in essence, they were very similar to the project plans from Trust A. The trustee capability development was to encourage trustees to undertake capability development in identified target areas to further develop their governance skills. The Trust was already doing quite a lot right, but they needed some upskilling in certain areas. The land use and productivity was again designed to develop initiatives to maximise the productive potential and capacity of the land, and in particular to move from a passive to a more active model of land use. And the project on the investment framework was to develop initiatives to increase income from off-land investments. I'd now like to go on and look in more detail at the monitoring and evaluation framework that we used, because that was the basis for much of the work over a 2-year period. And the purpose of monitoring and evaluation is to determine the extent to which the project delivered on its objectives. There was a focus on achievements, on benefits, and on the value to the trusts and to the individual trustees. We used 2 monitoring and evaluation models. The results chain you have seen and you've used, and that describes what the trust wanted to achieve, how you would go about it. The other one, which you probably are not so familiar with, is Bennett's hierarchy, and that measures incremental change, and we'll have a look at both of those. In terms of the results chain model, a little bit earlier in this presentation, we looked at the various components in that top bar. But if we look now at what constitutes the focus of monitoring and the focus of evaluation, which are the grey and orange circles at the bottom. The focus of monitoring is the inputs. That's the work we do, and the outputs, which are deliverables. And that's when we worked with you on the 2 monitoring sessions. Those are the areas that we were looking at. What activities were you doing, and what were you actually delivering as a result of those activities? In contrast, the focus of evaluation refers to those orange blocks, and that focuses on the outcomes, which is what we want to achieve in the shorter term, and the impacts, which is the changes we want to see in the longer term. As I mentioned earlier, because of this relatively short timeline of the project, we were not able to get to the impact stage, but we were able to focus on some of the benefits which, even in a relatively short timeline, were becoming fairly obvious. And just in terms of the acknowledgement, the results chain model, I'm acknowledging the World Bank and the United Nations Development Programme for the use of that particular tool.
So, sorry, excuse me, who actually produced that one?
The United Nations Development Programme. The other model that we used was Bennett's hierarchy. And it measures incremental change in the course of a program. And it's particularly useful in use where perhaps programs do not achieve the end result in the relatively short time frame of the program, such as the one that we are looking at today. The steps are overlapping. They are not discrete steps, they are overlapping steps. So it's possible for changes in knowledge and skill, for example, to be overlapping with participation in the program. The step 1 inputs and step 2 activities we pretty much measured under the result chain. But we used this particular model to measure steps 3, 4, 5, 6, and to some extent step 7. Step 3 was participation. How well were the trustees and the trust participating in this program? What was stopping them participating? What was helping them participate? In terms of reactions, we wanted to know how the trustees were reacting to the program. What was their level of interest? What was their level of motivation for involvement in the program? Step 5 was CASA change, and that's simply an abbreviation for changes in knowledge, skills and attitudes. As you worked through the program, trustees were learning, and we wanted to know what the changes were in those learnings in terms of skill and knowledge. Step 6 was practice change, because when trustees were learning, they were also starting to apply that knowledge and skill, and that was resulting in changes in how the trust was being operated, i.e. practice change. And finally, we wanted to look at the ultimate benefits, which was the end results. And in terms of acknowledgement, C.F. Bennett, United States Department of Agriculture, is the author of that particular model. How do we gather information? We gathered a lot of information. And we basically gathered it using 5 different methods. The first was a self-completion questionnaire for individual trustees, and that looked at trustee participation, motivation, learnings, and the overall value of the program. We had a 2-hour workshop with both trusts, and that looked at the efficiency of implementation, the effectiveness and outcomes of the program, the relevance to the trust, because if the program wasn't relevant to the trust, then why were we wasting time and effort on it? Its ongoing sustainability. How well would the program continue after Hinamana Solutions left the scene? And finally, what were the benefits and outcomes of that program? The trustees gave presentations on project plans, looking at the achievements and benefits. And that was a really valuable session, and I'd like to thank the trustees for all the time and effort that they put into developing those presentations. It was really great. We had a focus group of beneficial owners, and 2 of those owners are here today, and thank you both for participating in that focus group. And that focus group captured the observations of the owners on the program, the adoption of learnings, and their perceptions of the practice change by trustees over that short timeline. And finally, we had a self-completion questionnaire which looked at the satisfaction of the trustees with us as facilitators. And I was also privileged to attend a trust board meeting where I was looking and observing in terms of the changes in trustee skill and the application of those learnings to a trust board meeting. And thank you for allowing me to do that. Now we've now reached the most exciting part of the whole project, and that's the findings. What actually happened? What were the results after all that hard work? And the results are in 3 sections. And the first one I want to look at is the project activities. And this comes largely out of the project presentations that the trustees gave during the evaluation phase. And we're going to look at each of the projects and some of the key outcomes that came out of those projects. Well, firstly, governance capability development. Some of the outcomes were improved governance skills, particularly in risk management and financial oversight, and in general governance activities such as handling conflicts of interest, because conflict of interest was quite a major issue when we started working with the trust. There was improved capability around strategic thinking and planning. When we started working with the trust, they were thinking very operationally. They weren't thinking strategically, and they weren't planning at all well. And that changed markedly over the course of the project. There was improved communication between the trustees, and that was important because it generated teamwork. For the first time, the trustees were working as a team and not as a series of individuals. Everyone had been very busy doing their own thing, but there was limited communication, and sometimes trustees didn't even know what another trustee was actually doing. Well, that all changed, and that was really valuable. And perhaps 2 of the key areas there was the move towards evidence-based decision-making and consensus decision-making as distinct from majority decision-making. And that gave overall better decisions. And also, the evaluation of options were now based on solid evidence and research and factual information, rather than on whims or if someone had been approached by a particular owner and pressure exerted on them. Decisions were being made based on fact rather than fiction. In terms of governance processes and boardroom practices, the Trust produced a governance manual which contained documented governance policies and systems, including how to manage conflict of interest. There were improved board meetings with pre-circulated board papers, a prioritised board agenda, and that led to shorter meetings and more timely decisions. The Trustee Appointment Model Project. The trustees developed a new model of trustee appointment based on skills and competencies and a finite term of rotation. They developed 3 alternative models and they were put forward to the beneficial owners for consideration. An important project, as I mentioned earlier, was the stakeholder engagement and communication, and that had two components. The first of those was with the beneficial owners. As a result of this program, there was increased frequency of communication with the owners. The owners highly valued the newsletter. They also valued, particularly amongst the younger people, the use of Facebook and electronic media. There is now a progress in place to extend the database of beneficial owners. It's recognised that without a good database, it's going to be very difficult to reach some of the owners. And progress has been made in documenting a process for beneficial owners to bring matters to the attention of the board and for the board to respond in a timely manner. A very successful wānanga was held on the Trust's lands, which was strongly supported, and that has resulted in an increased level of interest and engagement of the owners with their lands. The communication with external stakeholders was the second part of that project. And the process of communicating with licence holders and other external partners has been streamlined, with 2 senior trustees with the appropriate level of experience and mana are now responsible for that area. And that alone has resulted in more harmonious working relationships and an increased level of interest from external parties in the development of partnerships with the Trust. The project on land use and productivity. Significant progress has been made with that project. It's not at the end point yet, but it's certainly a work in progress. And probably the single biggest thing that happened was raised awareness with the trustees of the value of moving from a passive to an active model of land management. And the Trust is taking on advice on how that might occur. The Trust is investigating opportunities for Mānuka honey production and adventure tourism. And they now have a vision to operate their own Mānuka honey business in association with suitable partners. And a business case is being prepared for that. An aside that came out of this project, which was valuable, was the increased technical and industry knowledge, particularly around the Mānuka honey industry, and that's been obtained through working with others in the industry and through attending industry conferences. Okay, just carrying on with the next project, alternative approaches to generate income, and that too is still work in progress. The Trust has identified options for an increased commercial focus and improved financial returns, and there are 3 areas that they're working on there. One is the development of an appropriate investment portfolio. The secondly, looking at an investment in another business to become decision makers rather than decision takers. And the third one is to look at vertical integration of the Mānuka honey production to give better overall control of the value chain. That's management speak. What it basically means is that the Trust would control all aspects of Mānuka honey from the production side right through to marketing. And I guess that's going to be a work in progress probably for some considerable time. The final project was collaboration, and as I said earlier, this was probably the project which was the glue that held the other 6 projects together, and there were areas of overlap between this project and 3 or 4 of the others. And again, significant progress has been made in this particular area. The program raised awareness of the value of tapping into others with relevant skills. And I guess for the first time, the Trust began to realise that they didn't have to do everything themselves. There were other people out there who could assist and who were willing to assist and who were prepared to become partners with the Trust. The Trust has developed a structured approach to collaborative activities, and that includes things like the identification of potential alliances and partners, and doing due diligence on them. Not every partner or every person that you identify is going to be an appropriate partner. So it's very important to do due diligence. What can they bring to the table? what can Trust A bring to the table? And then are the two areas compatible? Is it going to move the Trust forward in terms of what the Trust wants to do? And the Trust is also a member of various industry bodies now, and that's helping with the development of networks, it's helping with the acquisition of information. And the Trust is also investigating various partnership arrangements with the existing licence holders, and there's also potential for commercial partnerships with neighbouring trusts. So that is very much a work in progress, and we look forward to seeing what the longer term outcomes are going to be. Trust B, the project activities associated with Trust B. Well, in terms of capability development, the assessment process raised awareness of best practice with the Trust, and they were able to use to advantage the decision-making tools and templates that we provided. But with this Trust, the trustees didn't really see the value of upskilling. They didn't see the relevance to them, and in fact, in some ways, they took offence at the suggestion that they needed upskilling. So they had closed minds to the whole process, and the intended outcomes were not achieved. In terms of land use and productivity, the trustees finally opted to continue with a slightly modified version of their current lease arrangements. We did manage to raise awareness with them of the value of alternative land use models, but again, the intended outcomes of that project were not achieved. In terms of the project on investment framework, the trustees did obtain a proposal from an external consultant, but they did not progress that, and again, the intended outcomes of that project were not achieved either. We hope that with a change in trustees, there may still be an opportunity for some of those areas of activity to be picked up. I'd now like to look at the second section on findings, which is going to look at the participation, the behaviour change and the practice change, mainly within Trust A, with one or two comments from Trust B. If we look first at the capability development cycle. Well, the capability development cycle has 4 components. The first of those is participation. If people don't participate, they're not going to get anything out of it. So participation is number 1. And later on in this presentation, I'm going to talk about what can help trustees participate and what is actually preventing them from participating. As a result of participation, trustees learn. They learn skills, they learn knowledge, and they learn how to apply it. And we call that the learnings. And that can result over time in behaviour and attitude change. Won't happen overnight, but it does happen over a period of time, and it happens progressively. And finally, that behaviour and attitude change can lead to a change in practice. People can do things differently as a result of the participation in learnings. If we look at the Trust participation from the 2 trusts, Trust A, strong early support for the project, a passionate project champion in Murray. It's a pity he's not here today, but he really was a strong advocate for the program. The trustees were engaged. All of you were engaged, some more than others, but you were all engaged. And right from the start, the project was given a high level of priority. And I think we have to thank Coro for that, because he was a leader in giving that project the area of, or the aura of priority that it had. There was some initial hesitancy to commence the projects, and that was entirely understandable. This was all new territory. But there was gradually a building of momentum and confidence as the program progressed. And I want to emphasise this word confidence, because initially the trustees were fearful of what it was all unknown, and they totally lacked confidence, some of them. And it was really pleasing to see how the trustees developed in confidence as this program progressed. And finally, we ended up with a high level of enthusiasm and ownership, and I think I can say that all the trustees exhibited that. And sitting in the background was support from the beneficial owners, and that was valuable. Trust B behaved slightly differently. There was initial support, and there were two passionate project champions, both long-serving trustees, who were able to look at the bigger picture. But unfortunately, the trust became dysfunctional, and due to internal issues, a majority of the trustees disengaged. The project became a low priority, limited progress was made, and the majority of the trustees were content to support the status quo. They were very conservative, they were very risk averse, and they simply didn't see the value of change. So how does all that translate into behaviour and attitude change? And we can just work through a number of these things. The lessons learned were largely gained through the assessment process, the development of the project plans, and the follow-up mentoring and support in the various training sessions that the trustees undertook. And as a result of that, the lessons learned are now starting to be translated into significant attitude and behaviour change for the trustees. And Shona and I were able to observe those changes over the 2-year period that we were working with you. And those changes have the potential to impact positively on the work of the trust. Just to look at some of them, separating governance and operational functions has ensured clearer governance oversight and accountability. The Trust is now prepared to adopt best practice models. They're now aware of what constitutes best practice, and they're prepared to look at adopting the appropriate tools and systems and models. They are now taking a much more strategic view and looking at the wider perspective. In other words, their thinking has shifted from operational activities to a strategic focus, which is what governance is all about. They're keeping focused on the task at hand. They're taking a step-by-step approach and remaining focused instead of using an ad hoc and scattergun approach that they were using at the beginning. And the project plans and the results chain are two models which have contributed to that. There is now much better communication between the trustees and within the trust, and as I've mentioned earlier, to the beneficial owners and to the commercial partners. And that has led to a commitment to achieving results, to the trust working as a team to get things done. The trust has effective leadership to lead from the front, and that is absolutely critical. Not only did this project have a strong project champion, they have a chair who believed in the program, and it was very pleasing to see the trustees step up to a leadership role in terms of managing the various project activities that they had been allocated. Some were more effective than others, but we were really delighted with the way that some trustees did show leadership skills in terms of stepping up to the plate. There's also, they understand the issues. They obtain relevant information and they generate and evaluate alternatives options, and they're using consensus rather than majority decision making. So the whole decision making process has improved. And the trustees are now much more aware of making use of specialist support to assist in the development of new initiatives. They now recognise that they may not have all the skills and capability in-house or the capacity required, and they're prepared to go outside the trust to get that information. So how does this result in practice change? And even within the 2 years of the project, Shona and I have been able to see a change in a number of practices with the trust. And the first of those is governance and financial oversight. There was the adoption of a model of trustee election or appointment based on skills and capability. The trustees have adopted a much more rigorous and evidence-based decision-making process. They now look at the wider picture. They take time to understand the issues. They do the required research, and they generate the options for consideration and evaluation. The board has adopted consensus decision-making, and they now take collective responsibility for the board decisions. And that stopped the behind-the-scenes sniping that was going on in some areas. The skills that they have learnt in risk management and financial oversight and decision-making are now being applied to the everyday workings of the trust, and they support the implementation of the trust strategic plan. In terms of best practice governance systems and processes, the trust now has a much more structured trust board meetings with the prioritisation of agenda items and the application of the documented governance policy systems and processes to those meetings. That's resulted in shorter, more streamlined meetings and a better use of trustee time. Trustee meetings at the beginning were evidently going on for some considerable time. And I think the one that I attended, we got through in just over an hour. So there was a marked change there. And it's also assisted trustees being kept more informed with trust happenings. Everyone knows what's going on, everyone's involved, and that can only be to the benefit of the trust. The governance manual, that was such a labour of love, that is now being implemented, and for the first time it's being used to guide the governance role of the trust. And for the first time now, the trust has written policies, governance policies, not operational policies, governance policies, which are being followed. Communication, teamwork and relationships. That was a very important area. And the wānga was held on Trust Day lands in February of this year proved to be a very good learning ground for trustees, and that it pulled together the aspects of planning, communication, risk management and stakeholder engagement. And for the first time, it provided the opportunities for the trustees to work together as a team. It was also a very good example of getting the trustees to be task-focused and to work collaboratively towards a common goal. The capability development process itself has reinforced the importance of clear, unambiguous communication between trustees and also with their business partners in order to achieve a successful outcome. Something that we hadn't perhaps anticipated was the value of the adoption of technology, because the trust is now using email and electronic media to communicate with the owners and with the trustees. And there is also the opportunity for the trust now to use Skype and other electronic methods to communicate with trustees who are not necessarily located in the area. So there could be a trustee appointed to the trust who lives in Christchurch or Auckland, for example, and they could Skype in or use email communication and still take an active role in the affairs of the trust. Leadership. Now, leadership is absolutely critical. No matter what entity you're in, leadership is critical. And both the beneficial owners and the trustees have recognised the importance of and the need for good leadership for the trust in order to motivate the trustees, to inspire others, and to create an environment of effective communication and achievement. And that will likely be reflected in future appointments to leadership positions within the trust. I've mentioned before that for both trusts, one or two trustees took a lead role to champion the program. And it's really pleasing to see now that other trustees have actually stepped up and are taking a much more active role in a leadership role in the affairs of the trust. And this program has in effect provided an opportunity for less experienced trustees to step up to leadership positions with the support of the more experienced trustees. In terms of collaboration, partnerships and the development of joint ventures, the Trust is making very good use of the skills and knowledge gained in this area and is applying it now to the development of business models and to the development of potential partnerships. Trustees are much more aware of the value of tapping into external parties, people and organisations who might have the skills and capability to assist. And they are now much more aware that they may not necessarily have all the skills that are needed, but it is of value to tap into external skills. There's been a significant change in the Trust's thinking around moving from a passive to a more active model of business management of their land resource. And there is now an increased awareness of the potential opportunities available for the development of their land through collaboration and partnerships. And the Trust is now engaged in discussions with other parties to try and progress those areas of activity. The third section on the findings is looking at the feedback we received from the beneficial owners. There's only 2 of you here today, but thank you for that participation. We held a focus group of 6 beneficial owners, and they were canvassed for their views on their level of engagement with the affairs of the Trust, their communication with the trustees, the perceptions that they had of any change in Trust performance since the program began, and their perception of the overall value of the project to the Trust. And they had some very relevant comments to make. Now, this table looks at the component, it looks at the issues that the owners raised, and it also looks at the improvements that the owners noted since the beginning of this project. In terms of Trust leadership, the owners felt that leadership needs to be shown by the whole Trust board and not just the chair, which is a fair enough comment. And the trustees should take collective responsibility for the decisions that they make. In terms of improvements noted, the owners are very impressed that the trustees are endeavouring to upskill for the benefit of the Trust, and they made some very favourable comments in that area. They've noted a marked improvement in decision-making processes, and they felt the AGM was better run and with more positive outcomes. That was the last AGM. In terms of awareness of the owners of Trust activities, there was limited and variable awareness, and that seemed to relate to the extent to which the owners had direct involvement with the trustees. Some were much better informed than others, and some had very limited knowledge of what was going on. And the owners have noted a small increase in the level of awareness over the course of the program. Communication between trustees and owners, this seemed to be quite an issue. And it was generally felt that the communication was inconsistent, both on frequency and distribution. Many of the owners have limited access to broadband and electronic media, and they still rely on print media, word of mouth, those are most commonly used, and radio. And of course, the incomplete database of owners does make it very difficult to communicate with many of the owners. In terms of improvements noted, the owners felt that the current quality and frequency of communication is the best that they have seen. And that's a real feather in the cap of the trustees for making the effort to communicate better with their owners. The owners particularly valued the newsletter. They felt that the use of electronic media was probably more relevant to the younger people. But the owners also valued the fact that the trustees are meeting more regularly with owners to seek their views, and that they are now listening more to the views of the owners. In terms of the process for communication with the Trust Board, the issue is that there is no documented or advised process, and the owners usually use a written letter, and sometimes the trustees do not provide a reason for a decision. And an issue that trustees do need to take on board is that the owners may not be comfortable about approaching some trustees. They felt some trustees were dismissive, were not listening to them, were not interested in the points that they had to raise. And over the duration of the program, no improvements were noted, but we would certainly hope that would improve with the program which is being developed at the moment, where there is in train a process for trustees and to communicate with the owners and for owners to bring issues to the attention of the board. The interaction of beneficial owners with the trust board and their lands. The issue was that there was limited engagement of the owners with the happenings of the trust outside the AGM. And there were limited opportunities for the owners to engage with their lands. And it was felt that the trustees rarely involve other owners in providing input into or assistance with trust affairs. The owners were very happy to make a contribution, but they often didn't know if there was a need, and they hadn't been approached. But in terms of improvements noted, the owners highly valued the presentations from the trustees regarding what is happening on their lands and inviting feedback. They particularly valued the wānanga held on their lands in February, and they particularly value the meetings with trustees to discuss issues of significance. So when you look at all the factors there and the items that the owners value, it all comes back down to communication. Good, consistent, clear communication and engagement. And that's probably something the trustees need to take on board. So, what did all that boil down to? Still room for improvement was the general statement that was made. There has been improvement, but there's still room for more. So what do the owners want to see happen? They would like to see greater frequency of communication. They would like the trustees to listen more to the views of the owners. They would like a defined and advised process for bringing matters to the attention of the trust board. They want increased connectivity with their land, more wānanga on their lands, the scope to hold more frequent wānanga on topics of special interest. And interestingly enough, they came up with a really interesting range of topics that the trustees might like to consider. And they included things like trees, history, land and forests, whakapapa, walkways, the water resource, land use issues, management of natural resources, ideas to reconnect people to their land, political issues associated with the land, and rangatiratanga. So there's certainly some issues there that the trustees can give consideration to in terms of how they can engage more with their owners and get the owners to engage more with their lands. The owners have also asked for a greater opportunity, where relevant, to provide input and to assist with trust affairs, so that the trustees make use of the skills and abilities that are available within their own trust. It doesn't need to be a threat to the trustees, and after all, the trustees are elected or appointed to govern the trust. But in terms of project-based activities, there may well be people within the trust that the trustees can use to assist them. The owners felt that trustees need to take a more collective responsibility for the decisions made, and I think we are now starting to see that happen with the better decision-making processes that the trust board is adopting. The trust board requires strong leadership, and we've talked about that. And they also requested that the performance of the trust board should be measured annually. Now, that is a standard governance procedure. The performance of any governing body does need to be reflected on at least. You don't need to do a whole lot of measurement, but certainly reflect on what went well, what didn't do quite so well over the course of the year, and what you could do better. So that's also something to take on board. So what were the benefits of the program? And firstly, I want to look at relevance, because if the program is not relevant to the trusts, then it's not going to be of any value to them. But both trustees and the owners felt that the project was highly relevant to the trusts. And the reason they said that is that the projects were aligned to the trust strategic plans, and the process of developing project plans made it much easier for the trustees to clarify some of their strategic plan portfolio areas. And the planning process associated with that identified what needed to be accomplished and by when. The capability assessment process itself identified areas of strength and weakness in the trust. The strengths can be built on, the weaknesses can be remedied. The project introduced trustees to the elements of best practice across general governance areas, but also in terms of systems and processes and managing conflicts of interest in decision-making, planning and risk management. And as a result of that, the project supported good governance, improved performance and improved accountability. As we've said earlier, the project raised awareness of, and it also provided support for, moving from a passive to a more active model of land use. And it supported activities that would not have perhaps been addressed by any other means, and this is something we didn't expect to come out of the project. It identified effectively that the trustees didn't know what they didn't know. In other words, you can't develop skills and abilities in an area if you don't know that you actually lack them, or you don't know that you need them. And then, having identified that, the program actually provided the tools, support and resources for the trustees to learn. And as a result of that, the trustees began to learn from each other. And that resulted in shared learnings. It wasn't just individual, they were starting, it was all part of working as a team. Moving on to benefits, I've separated them into two areas. One, which is an internal focus, which is within the trust itself. The second part is an external focus, which is looking outside the trust. And if you look at the green circle in the centre, it says raised awareness. And I guess that was one of the most important benefits of this program. It raised awareness across almost all aspects, including the trustee roles and responsibility and what was needed to improve trustee performance. The internal and external communication. The internal communication improved, the trustees are now working as a team. And the external communication to external stakeholders has improved, resulting in better management of external relationships. There was increased skill, knowledge and capability across many areas. And as a result of that, there is the potential for personal growth through increased confidence. And that was one of the things we saw, was the increase in confidence of some of the trustees as they moved through the program. The program highlighted where the trust needed to step it up, and it raised awareness of what constituted best practice. And that led to improved governance and financial oversight, the adoption of best practice models, and more robust and confident decision making. And the program also improved engagement with beneficial owners. And the trustees were able to demonstrate to the owners that the trust is now moving down a path that will benefit the trust as a whole. Looking at the benefits with an external focus, and again, I have raised awareness in that centre circle. Because again, the program raised awareness of a lot of areas of activity that the trust and the trustees had not otherwise considered. The passive versus active models of land management. The active model having the potential to increase the returns significantly to the trust. The building of relationships and networks to increase knowledge and to link into industry associations. The gains in technical knowledge, so that trustees are now able to critically analyse and evaluate options and partnerships. The significant potential to develop partnerships, which has the potential to lead to new business ventures and to new marketing opportunities. And probably the Manukau Honey Initiative is going to be the best example of that. The program also helped with leveraging network and cross-sector relationships, including looking at Manukau honey production with neighbouring trusts and using collaboration with other landowners for advice and to leverage their own networks too. So as a result of this, the trust has stopped looking inside the boundaries of the trust and now has a much broader perspective in terms of its external relationships and workings. and there's also an opportunity for stronger communication channels to government agencies, such as the Department of Conservation for the Land Covenant. The Trust is now represented on various Māori organisations, including FOMA, and the Ministry of Primary Industries is now recognising the Trust has value in terms of assisting with the development of a Mānuka honey industry. So what were the benefits as seen by the beneficial owners? Because they had a slightly different perspective to the trustees. And if you look at that interior circle, the dark green circle in there, you will see it says improved accountability to the owners. And that's probably where all this headed. Improved accountability of the trust and the trustees to the owners. And after all, the trust is accountable to the owners. The owners appoint them, and the trust is accountable to them. That's standard governance process. And that improved accountability was seen through improved governance skill and capability across a range of governance functions, greater transparency in that the owners are now more aware of what is happening, improved communication, improved decision making, and more robust decisions based on sound evidence. But the process of this program has also reinforced to the beneficial owners two things. It's reinforced the need for strong leadership, and it's reinforced the importance of skill and capability-based trustee appointments. And we hope that both those will be taken into account in new trustee elections. The program did have a number of unintended consequences, and these are things that perhaps weren't expected. Because to a certain extent, when you set a program up, you have some idea of what's going to happen out the other end of it. But there's 5 things there, or 4 things, that were unintended consequences, all positive, as a result of this program. The first is that Trust Day is now being recognised externally as being aspirational and an agent of change for Māori. It is a leader in the development of the Mānuka honey business, and it is an entity with which there is value in developing partnerships. And those are both very important for the longer term. It has identified potential for collaboration with neighbouring trusts and commercial ventures, perhaps where there's been no collaboration previously or not for a long time. There's now an opportunity to overcome that barrier. The skills learnt in this program can be applied to the work of the trustees with other trusts. It can be applied to the work of the trustees in their day-to-day jobs. So the skills and knowledge that have been learnt are not necessarily confined to the boundaries of the trust. They go much wider than that. And an interesting one is that there's a recognition of the need for succession planning. The trust should now be looking to who they want to have on the trust board, who they want to have as trustees. Look towards some younger people and perhaps even provide training for them in governance and buddy them up with an existing senior trustee, so that when it becomes time for them to become trustees, they are much more aware, skilled and trained up to take on that role. I'm going to talk briefly to something called the Land Resource Framework and the alignment that the two trusts had. Now many of you will not know what it is. I have the report here. This was a report which was done by the former Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in 2011. And we will be putting a reference to it on the website of resources when that happens. But just very briefly, it defines 3 tiers of Māori freehold land. Tier 1 was a well-developed business, Tier 2 underperforming entities, and Tier 3 underutilised land. And Tier 3 underutilised land was due to a broad range of factors, including the productive potential of the land not being realised. And under this framework, there were a number of sub-tiers. And Tier 3.1, and you'll find why I use Tier 3.1 in a minute, that was described as land with inherent productive capacity in long-term lease, low economic returns to the owners, and not necessarily producing productive capacity. At the start of this project, we assessed both trusts as to where they fitted on that framework, and both trusts were assessed at level 3.1 in 2014. There were variations between them, but that was largely where they sat. Trust B, unfortunately, remains at tier 3.1, and the program has had no significant benefit to it. It's had negligible impact on that trust. But Trust A is very different, and Trust A is now moving progressively towards tier 1. You're not there yet, but there's certain elements that show that you are on the way. And that has really been because of the improved governance capability, a stronger strategic and planning focus, improved skill development, the development of business models to increase the returns to the trust, and the development of collaborative ventures. So what I say to you is keep at it, because you do have the potential to become a tier 1 trust, but it's going to take an awful lot of hard work to actually get there. How do we take the project forward? What are the factors supporting or limiting participation by tier 3 trusts? And again, I'd just like to touch on the relevance of the program to Ahu Whenua tier 3 trusts. This is not Trust A, it's not Trust B, it's Ahu Whenua tier 3 trusts in general. And the project was considered highly relevant for supporting tier 3 trusts where there was a need for improvement. And those areas for improvement include governance, skill and capability development, strong governance oversight and decision making, the consideration of alternative models for land use, commercial initiatives and partnership development, and looking at increasing the engagement of beneficial owners with their land. And better governance oversight would, of course, hopefully mean fewer cases before the Maori Land Court. But also, if those factors can be considered, they are essential in supporting the trust, or any trust, any tier 3 trust, to move towards tier 1. So how does it happen? Factors supporting participation. The trustees themselves must be prepared to participate and engage. If they're not, we're not going anywhere. The trustees need to be committed and receptive to change. They need to work as a team. They need to recognise their skill and capability shortcomings and be prepared to remedy those. And they need to focus on working for the good of the trust. That is, they need to have a wider perspective outside their own personal agendas. And the trust itself would need strong and effective leadership to lead from the front. They would need an internal champion to drive the project and to remove roadblocks to progress. They would need to be committed to strong and effective governance and to the accountability that goes with that. And they need to recognise the importance of networking to gain access to information and of utilising external skills and specialist advice where that was relevant. And they would also need some ability to fund external support to facilitate the program. But there are also a number of potential factors which might limit participation. And one of the big ones there is that the trustees are voluntary. There were huge constraints on trustee time. There were conflicting demands on their time. They had other things they had to do. They all had a day job. They were doing this for the love of the trust. There was time required to develop new skills. This was all new to a lot of the trustees. And they needed time to absorb that information and to be able to apply it. There might have been a lack of personal commitment or an unwillingness to work collaboratively. Trustees may be risk averse or very conservative, or there may have been a lack of leadership to drive change. And all those can limit participation. Trustees may not have known where to start with the project. Again, it was all new. And we certainly found this with the monitoring that we did. When we did the first monitoring, there was almost a dead stop, nothing had happened. And we realised that the trustees didn't know where to start. They didn't know how to progress it. And once we got over that particular hiccup, they were off. But it just needed that little bit of a push and a nudge and a bit of support. There's often confusion between a governance and operational roles. And if you're a member of a trust board, you are in a governance role. It's not to say that you don't have operational activities to deal with as part of your trustee duties, but you are basically there in a governance role. And there may also have been unwillingness by some trustees to acknowledge personal skill gaps. It's not a threatening process. But if you don't acknowledge the skill gaps that you've got and be receptive to change and receptive to taking on new information, then nothing's going to happen either. The trust resources is a key one because the trusts do need to have funds available or access to external funds to support the program. And even if some trusts do have the funds available, they may be unwilling to commit those funds, which is what we found with Trust B. So that can be a barrier too. Development of commercial initiatives. Some of the factors limiting participation there are a lack of knowledge and experience, and particularly in the technical areas, a lack of skill in the development of collaborative partnerships, the time required for due diligence and investigative work, a lack of funding to take advantage of external assistance. The trustees may lack skill and capability to be able to identify and consider alternative options for land use. The trustees or the trust may be very conservative and risk averse, and that can be trustees, it can be the trust, it can be the beneficial owners, but that itself may limit investment in land development opportunities. And the trust may not be willing to take any risks greater than simply having money in the bank. And finally, the trust order itself may limit opportunities. And if the trusts are serious about developing new commercial ventures, there may be a need to actually change the trust order. So how could we do better? Nothing's perfect. And we've picked up 5 areas here where we feel the program could be improved. Firstly, pre-screening of trusts, to ensure that all the trusts have the capacity, resources and motivation to participate, because if they don't, they're not going to get very far in the project. There needs to be additional information sharing and an initial engagement with both the trustees and the beneficial owners to tell them about the project, to tell them what we hope the project will do and to get the trust on board. We'd like to see an increased level of support during the course of the program through regular review and monitoring. We had 2 monitorings with this program and it probably wasn't enough. There needed to be more monitoring type support and mentoring to get the trustees over some of the roadblocks and to help them through the process. The funding timeline was too short. There needs to be a minimum of 3 years for longer term initiatives, because we're not quite sure what's going to happen now that Shona and I have actually left this project. We hope that the trustees will be able to continue, but that support resource is no longer there. We need to provide external resourcing, and that's, for example, remuneration for trustees. The trustees put a huge amount of time and effort, and personal time and effort, into this program, and that should be remunerated. Money might also be required for implementation of initiatives or for the infrastructure development, and possibly when you look at the Manukau honey industry on a whākau lands, for that to progress, you're probably going to need infrastructure, and someone needs to fund that. And also funding for a paid external resource, whether that's a skill or a particular specialist area of activity you want to bring in, or for paid facilitators. And finally, we get to the recommendations. Well, the recommendations are short and sweet. We've got 3. The first recommendation is that the Ministry of Primary Industries acts as the enabling agent to roll out the project to other Tier 3 trusts. It's not going to happen if someone doesn't take the initiative to do it, and the most logical organisation to do that is the Ministry of Primary Industries. Recommendation 2 is that the suggested project amendments are adopted, and that's what I've just gone through. The pre-screening of trusts, the information sharing, the extending of the timeline, and providing external support. And the third recommendation is that the Ministry of Primary Industries facilitates the securement of external funding to support the trustees, external facilitation and implementation initiatives. And that funding could be a combination of public sector or private sector funding. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. Thank you for listening. What we'd like to do now, and Shona's going to facilitate this next session, we would like to get your feedback on what you think of the benefits of the program, as we've outlined, what you think of the recommendations that we have made to the Ministry of Primary Industries, and also what your views are on how much of this information do you want to see in a public forum in relation to your trust.